Hey everyone, today's tutorial is on testing for COVID infection. And those of you who follow me on Facebook or my patients, I just was tested Monday, the first week of May, and my IgG test is negative. That means that I have been exposed, but I have not mounted a response. So theoretically, that acquired immunity did not kick in. Now, that could be taken as a thumbs up because that means I don't have the infection and never had the infection, even with my exposures. Or it could be a thumbs down if you think, well, wait a minute, I can still get infected. So either way, it is available, at least in blood test form. So I'm going to talk about that. There's also the nasal swab form, the PCR tests that are also available. Yesterday, I sent somebody for that. And I have been sending people for that for at least the last several weeks. And it is a little, well, I'll talk about that in a second. But there was a 3-hour wait in a car line. So you're going to have to deal with it. Hopefully, this is definitely better than when I first started doing these COVID videos because we didn't have any tests available, and now they are. So which one do you decide on if you have a choice? It is nice, especially as we're allowed to get back into work and we're going to be in contact with other people who you don't know might or might not have the infection, might or might not have been exposed to the infection, or might not be carrying the infection or carrying the virus. So at least if you know you have the IgG antibody, you might be protected, but the durability of how long these antibodies will protect you is unknown. Again, it's a novel virus, but we'll just work with the information we have. So the FDA released information on a whole bunch of reviews that they said were okay. And EUA is Emergency Use Authorization. So they came up with this thing that allows a lot of companies to make their testing procedures or their testing kits. Now, I just opened this whole packet is a bunch of different companies. Here's one. So you can see that here they put the name of the test, the company, and then they'll put sensitivity and specificity. Without getting into the weeds as far as sensitivity, specificity, the bottom line with those two numbers is you want to have a high sensitivity and you want to have a high specificity. So most of these were pretty decent. This one that I showed you had a sensitivity of 92.2% and a specificity of 99.6%. So I guess as long as you know, you can research on your own, but honestly, you're going to be a prisoner to your insurance company because your insurance company will only allow you to go to a certain lab, and the certain lab will only have a contract with one of these. There's like 30 different blood test kits. So you're kind of a prisoner for what you have available to you, paid through by the insurance. And I can't guarantee that it's paid for. So please call your insurance company and make sure this stuff is paid for. But most of these are IgG tests. Some of them are IgG, IgM tests. And I might have lost some folks, anyway, with 92 and what was it, 99 on the sensitivity and specificity, that's a pretty decent test. In a nutshell, the sensitivity is if the possibility of being truly positive, because not every test is great, and the specificity, the second number I give you, is the possibility, percentage-wise, of being truly negative. So I'll just leave it at that. Some tests, as far as being truly positive, I don't want to get into too many weeds, so I'll just leave it at that. But blood tests are more accurate because of the 90s and the 90s, being sensitivity in the 90s and specificity in the 90s for most of these tests. The blood tests are, in general, more accurate than the swab of the nose. So I'll explain why. Whenever you have your sensitivity and specificity into the 90s, especially the high 90s, that's good. There should also be a confidence interval. So if you rewind this, you'll see that there was also a confidence interval that was published with that company. All of these things have confidence intervals. So they also should be high. So if the confidence interval is high, that means you can trust it. If the sensitivity is high, that means the possibility, if you are swabbed and positive, that possibility is high. Versus if you're swabbed and it's false negative, that means you can't have a false negative. That's why you don't want to have too low of a sensitivity test. Because if you have a false negative, you go in there, you have the infection, but the test for some reason came back negative. And you'll be thinking, yay, when in actuality, you'll be infecting everybody. The opposite is true too, as far as specificity. If the specificity is low, the one I showed you is not, it's 99, that's awesome. Most of these have specificities that are really good. If the specificity is low, lower than 80, like some of the nasal swabs, then you might be testing positive by mistake. So, and that's not good either. Because if you're positive, then you seclude yourself and you're anxious and you didn't have to. So there are some errors that occur. Bottom line is that there are some errors that occur. But to make this easy, as long as if you trust the doctor, if you trust me, your doctor, and I trust the companies that the advocate has aligned themselves with, or ACL has aligned themselves with, then that's cool. And again, for the most part, the blood tests, IgG and IgM, are pretty high on their sensitivity and specificity, so you are cool. So let's get back to the basics. Once the blood test is done, it should be back in about a day, most of them. And the reason that the IgG tests rolled out is because IgG concurs that you have had exposure and you now have antibodies. And in theory, as long as you're feeling okay, you can donate to other people. You can donate your antibodies, your serum, to other people. What do they do with that? They take your blood. If you've never donated blood, you'll lie down in a blood testing center, very sterile place, masked up in PPEs, and then they'll poke you with an IV and they'll just essentially take about a pint of blood. That's not that much, honestly. 500 ml is not that much. It's considering you have 6,000 ml for some of you. So, and it's actually, bloodletting is actually an old technique before medicine came about that got you healthy. So they'll take that blood, they'll spin it down to get antibodies to COVID, and they'll refine it and give it to somebody that's in crisis. So I think it's for a good cause. Now, that's if you're IgG positive and you're not symptomatic. If you're not thinking about donating, you just want to know that you have had the infection and you should be okay in the public, then again, that's a good thing. Theoretically, if you have IgG, you have mounted a response, and in case you come in contact with somebody else that's got an active infection, like a healthcare worker that's worrying that they might be exposed every single day to somebody with an active infection, it's reassuring to know that you have the antibodies, IgG, to COVID. Again, the durability of the antibodies, we don't know. Hopefully it'll last for a couple months. So if you have an antibody response to exposure that you had, you can probably rest assured, again, this is a novel virus, but you can probably rest assured that you will have protection for at least the next couple months. Now, then comes the idea that this virus will mutate. It theoretically has mutated between Asia, Europe, and America. But that's all hearsay and conjecture. We know that there's several different RNA patterns to it. That's a mutation theoretically. But in general, if you have IgG, you should be protected. If it comes around and drastically mutates by 2021, you might not be protected. And that's the theory with influenza injections or vaccines being given every year. So because the influenza that breaks out is actually a different influenza than the previous year. So a vaccine might give you a little bit of a head start by initiating with small irritation from pieces of the vaccine pieces of the virus that's predicted for the following year. If you inject it in a vaccine, your body mounts a little bit of an acquired response, and it gets the antibodies developed so that you can fight when the big surge comes up, if the big surge comes up at all, for that influenza year. Now, we're going to probably have corona vaccines coming around by 2021, so hopefully the virus that's being studied now and the vaccine that's being developed now, if it's given, might confer immunity by giving you a little bit of a reaction to next year's coronavirus. Who knows? It's unpredictable. And then you guys can arbitrate whether you want a vaccine or not. I would be careful with any vaccine that's released quick, though it has been fast-tracked. That's going to bring out some debate. But as far as the testing, that'll bring me to IgM testing. So there's something called an acquired response. There's two forms of responses that the body has to an invading organism. One is an innate response, where the body makes secretions, it coughs, it tears up, it has diarrhea, vomits. It sends out some initial infantrymen to fight an infection. That's innate. Everybody has that. Then there's an acquired response where your body gets exposed to the antigen, and these these humoral factors come out, and they get sensitized, and they learn to attack the antigen. So we're all developing an acquired response, which is the IgG, IgM. Those are antibodies. IgG usually shows that you had an infection, it's old. IgM says that you theoretically have an active infection and it's new. So some of the tests that I mentioned that were approved by the FDA are IgG, IgM, but most of them, the ones that I'm ordering at this point in time, are just IgG, and that's fine. IgM is rolling out. So once that becomes available, then we'll be testing everybody for IgG, IgM to figure out, just like we do with Epstein-Barr virus, with herpes zoster, with a couple of different viruses. We try to predict using the data if it's old, new, if it's active, if it's resurgent. So it gives us a better map to figure out how to take care of our patients with symptoms. So, or patients that are going to travel, or patients that are going to work in a healthcare situation. So you'll hear, if you're going to work in healthcare, that you have to have your antibodies tested. Even if your vaccines are there, even for school, some schools will still say, we insist that you have antibody tests and not just give us the vaccinated records. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea about what's available right now. I think that before I let this topic go of acquired immunity, I think that the healthier you are, the better the acquired response, the acquired immunity response. So if you have diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, your acquired response might be a little lagging, and it might be busy with fighting diabetes, or the white blood cells, like in a diabetic, for example. White blood cells also depend on insulin and glucose, and they're a little screwed up. So the white blood cells might not respond to the antigen that fast, so your immune system might be compromised, and that's how it works. HIV, your immune system definitely is compromised. You don't have enough. So those are the things, tobacco use, autoimmune disease. So if your immune system is busy doing something else, or doesn't have the ideas of what to do, or just doesn't have the energy to do it, it won't respond properly, and then the virus will multiply and overtake you. So that's why it's really important to be healthy. Whether it's COVID or heart disease, really try to change your lifestyle, because we're not done with this virus yet. I'll explain that in a second. So this is LabCorp. LabCorp, I got it from LabCorp's website. It talks about the polymerase chain reactors. So there's serology testing with antibodies, that's blood. It could be finger prick or arm poke. And then there's nasal swab, oral swab. That's the PCR chain reaction. Polymerase, so polymerase chain is, let's put it this way. The antigen that comes in the virus has an antigen, is an antigen. When it gets into the body, the antigen starts up or triggers that innate response and the acquired response, right? And the antigen itself can be tested for. And that's going to be tested with a nasal swab. But unfortunately, the nasal swab, this one says for LabCorp, sensitivity and specificity is 100%. Very unusual to read this. I cannot believe anything is 100%, because honestly, in anecdote, and we'll find all the data about a year from now when everything's analyzed, but in anecdote with my doctors in the hospital, The nasal swab is probably 70% effective for finding positives. But that means 30% of the people that get nasal swabbed are actually being told it's negative, but they have the disease. So compared to blood testing, the nasal swab has a couple of errors in it. So the errors can be in the form of maybe the nasal swab didn't go back far enough. I heard a couple of patients say they just put whoever tested them put the nasal swab like in this deep. The nasal swab has to go in this deep. It has to go in way back here in the nose to get all the secretions in the back. That's theoretically where most of the viral particles will be. And if you go way back in the nose and it's not fun, you should get out the viral particle on that cotton swab, and then you should have enough of that viral particle on the cotton swab to put the reagent on the cotton swab with the viral particle and in the exact time to see positive test or not. Now, that's where the error comes in. If you don't have, it's all probably human error, but if you don't have enough of a good swab, if you don't have enough of the reagent, it's supposed to be 1, 2, 3, I forget what it is. For influenza, it's 1, 2, 3. For strep throat, it's 1, 2, 3, and then you put your second reagent in. So there's a couple of steps that humans can screw up. The other thing, not user dependent, but patient dependent, is if you're too early in the process where you get infected, you're starting to get fever, starting to get sore throat, you're a little coughing, there might not be enough viral load to get when they swab you. So if there's not enough viral load, you'll be testing negative. And then you'll be saying, whoopee, but you'll still be dealing with a week to 2 weeks of terrible symptoms. I have a couple patients that are going through that, but they're going to do fine. So there are some errors with that. I tend to believe I look at the data, but I also listen to my friends. And the data says these tests are great. My friends that are actually in the front lines are saying, 70% predictive value. So anyway, so that's it for the antigen tests. So in basic language, there's antigen tests that can test you if you carry, if it's done properly, and if it's a good test kit, if it's done properly, it'll tell you whether you have an active infection from COVID and to just shelter at home. If you're negative and you have symptoms, honestly, my patients, I would still shelter at home. Assume positive. Before we had all these tests and all my videos, I said, if you have symptoms, I don't care if you are influenza or your allergy, or you just have a bronchitis from a bacteria, assume positive, isolate at home, and watch my video on how to isolate in a small quarter environment. And then hopefully in 7 days, you're great. But it's usually 2 weeks before anybody will have the symptoms. Again, on a couple days to 2 weeks. But by the time you pass 2 weeks, if you don't have symptoms and you've been exposed, you should be okay. If you still have symptoms, you might, or if you get worse, you might want to get evaluated, video or ER. So again, to find out where the tests are being done, I think if you're in Illinois, Aurora Outlet Mall, and there's a clinic that's an IDPH clinic in Elgin. I forgot the VNA. The VNA is also testing. Now, again, that's where I heard there's a 3-hour wait in a car line, I hear. So moving forward, so there's nasal swabs, PCR chain reaction antigen tests for immediate to see if you have the infection, and then there's serologic tests or more afterwards. So that's also a problem with blood testing. If you're in the beginning of the infection and you haven't really blossomed yet, if you're in the beginning of the infection and you get a serologic test, you might not have mounted an acquired response yet. So the antibodies might be negative. So that's why you have to wait a couple of days. I believe the IgG turns positive in about 3 to 7 to 8 days. IgM should turn positive sooner. But if you catch that too early, you might be negative. I don't think I caught it too early. Last exposure I had to my 3 or 4 patients with COVID, because we haven't seen anybody physically in the office, was about 4 weeks ago. Now, I can certainly have exposure in Mariano's or Target if I go to Target, but I'm trying to keep that limitation. I'm trying to limit that. I can certainly have it when I go hiking in the forest preserves, but I'm definitely keeping limitations to that. And if I lead anybody, they're 6 feet apart from me, masked up, and usually behind me. So, shouldn't touch your face. Next is Arup. Arup, on their website, they talk about IgG, IgM. They talk about their PCR chain. It's pretty good. They essentially talk about 2 types of antibody tests, 1 type of nasal or antigen test. the swab for the antigen and the antibody test. The cool thing with the antibody test, I'll show it later, is that you can get it this way, but there are a couple of companies that have been approved by the FDA. I'll show you in a second, but this is also Quest. So ARUP is where Quest and ACL and the hospital send some very difficult labs to, because ARUP, A-R-U-P, has very expensive equipment. Sometimes the labs, the hospitals can't afford those big machines because they have to be calibrated. They cost a lot of money. So the blood test centers will take your blood, send it off, and then sometimes the center, like the hospital, will send it off to a second place, like ARUP. Quest is a very popular place around here, around the U.S. And Quest has a nice, if you look at that website or what I just flashed, pretty decent Q&A about testing. One of the Q&As brought up, if you test positive for IgG, does that mean it's this COVID or coronavirus, or could it be the other coronaviruses? And that's a good question, because we do get exposed to other coronaviruses, not as lethal as this, but there are other coronaviruses. There's one Hong Kong University one, and there's about 5 different ones that are bad. There's many others that are not so bad. So the question is, when you have an IgG response, a serologic response, is it a response from this corona outbreak, or is it a response from a previous corona outbreak that your body has memory to? Memory comes in the antibodies. And that's not exact. That's not an exact science, but Quest is saying that the test kit they use is pretty good with, I think they said 99% specificity for the current COVID-2 antibody or virus. So that's good. I looked at the data. I couldn't find the data that said how they tested their test kits, because you have to test the test kits to figure out the sensitivity and specificity. And then somebody has to review that third party to make sure they're not some places, some companies you would assume just to get their product out will bend the rules a little bit, fib a little bit. So that's why you have to have a third party review. And then the FDA has to step on top of that, review the third party, everything. But now the FDA is, again, fast tracking. So hopefully all these companies are good, but we'll see. And then here's a cool one. So I just wanted to show this because this is the thing that, if those of you have taken a pregnancy test, this is what we use. This kind of thing where you get your finger, you prick your finger, and you put your blood on the you put your blood on one end, and it slowly sucks up with the reagent, the liquid that we put on it, a drop. Usually it's 2 stages. The reagent has to be dropped in, a specific amount of drops. You wait a little bit, and then a second reagent has to be put in. This one, I'm not sure about the test kit, but this was a company that was approved by the FDA. So you put your blood, and the reagent is put on top of the blood, and then it goes this way. The first line, if it's positive, will be IgM. Second line, if it's positive, will be IgG. Third line, if it's positive, that's your control to make sure that the machine, the thing, is working properly. And you have that in strep. 1 line, negative. 2 lines, positive. No lines, error. So this is pretty decent. It's checking your antibodies. There could be a little bit of error, because if you don't put the reagent in properly, that can screw up things. If you don't get enough blood out of your finger, that could screw up things. So Cellex looks like a good company. This is just information from ACL on what they have available. And so all these companies have been hired. And then I also... So in a nutshell, that's how the testing for COVID infections work at this point in time. Now, after we get through this coronavirus, we'll probably fine tune this, and I'm sure one company will come out as outstanding in its reliability. But we have yet to see that. We have to deal with what we have available to us, doctors and patients. So, and then hopefully the insurance company will cover it. So I want to test everybody. So anybody in my patients that's listening to this, call the office, schedule for a video visit. I have to figure out your symptoms. Even if you don't have symptoms, I still have to write down a couple things, and then we'll order the test. You guys have to make sure it's covered by insurance. I believe at this point in time, all insurances are supposed to be mandatorily covering everything. I don't know when that's going to let up. But get these tests done as soon as possible. It'll give you a lot of information. And when you go to the place, a lot of places have very strict rules. The blood testing centers, I went yesterday. I didn't know you have to stay in a car line, but I was the first one there. Wear a mask, please. Don't touch anything. Wash your hands when you're done. And hopefully the place that you go to is aseptic. Just as we get through this, and again, bottom line with me is you got to live a healthy life. But bottom line is that we have to prepare for the time when we're positive. And I think the country's polarized, and you're having some places that haven't seen the crisis kind of saying, I want to go back to work, and it's fair. But I think you have to trust the doctors and the data. The thing I wanted to bring up is Hokkaido went back. They didn't have that much of a surge, but they went back to letting people out. And then they had a second surge that was worse than the first surge. So they went back into isolation. This was last month. So we'll have to see how our country, the United States, does in letting people out. So I would still, if I were you, you're one of my patients, practice social isolation, practice distancing, wear your mask, wash your hands, be healthy, change your lifestyle now, because we're not done with this. I fear that we're going to have a second surge, and I don't want to be an alarmist, but hey, truth of the matter is, with the Spanish flu that occurred in 1918, there were 3 surges. Nobody ever counts the third surge, but the second surge was tough, big. That's when World War I, the troops were moving around back and forth. But that was old-fashioned movement. They're in a can and moved. Now we have travel that's everywhere across the earth, and that's going to spread fast. That's what's probably spread to New York quickly. So be careful. If you, in chess, if those of you play chess, you're going to sacrifice your pawns to get to a good position. So try not to engage anybody that is really frustrated and starving and wanting to break the law. Don't break the law. Don't engage. We'll hopefully get through this all together. I'm sure the government will listen to everybody, but we also have to make sure that we don't overwhelm the hospital systems, because if the fail-safe is, if you do get sick, you have to go to the hospital, and the hospital is too crowded, there's going to be a higher chance that some people will die. So far, I think we're prepped for it. We'll have to see. Stay healthy. If this gives you good ideas, great. If it doesn't, put your comments down below, or pass this on to other people that are on the fence as far as whether they want to test or not, or whether they want to go to a testing center because they're scared. And otherwise, I'll see you at the next tutorial.